Hey guys, tonight we embark on a journey back to ancient Egypt, stepping into the gilded yet surprisingly restrictive world of a royal concubine. Forget the romanticized images of flowing silk and endless leisure you might have seen in movies. The truth is, life in the pharaoh's harem was a relentless performance of beauty, strategy, and silent competition. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's truly fascinating to connect with so many of you across time zones. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun rises gently over the Nile, birds chirp, the palace stirs, and just as your dream is reaching its most dramatic moment, probably something involving a shirtless scribe and unlimited figs, you're awakened by the soft whisper of a servant telling you with alarming cheerfulness that you look a bit puffy this morning. Welcome to your life as a royal Egyptian concubine. You do not sleep in. The pharaoh might not visit today. In fact, he might not visit ever. But that doesn't matter. You are a state asset, a living ornament, and your body clock now belongs to the department of looking good before breakfast. You're lifted out of your linen sheets, scratchy but fashionable, and immediately handed a bronze mirror. This is not a gesture of kindness. It's a diagnostic tool. How's your complexion? Any eyebrow hairs gone rogue? Have your lips lost their lotus petal sheen? These questions are not rhetorical. Your entire future might hinge on whether or not your face looks slightly more radiant than the girl snoring next to you. Next comes stretching, not for fitness, for posture. A crooked back means bad profile angles, and bad angles mean you're stuck in the maybe later pile for eternity. You spend 10 minutes walking back and forth, balancing a bowl of scented water on your head while pretending you're happy about it. Breakfast arrives, a platter of dates, figs, and possibly a single pomegranate seed that someone cut in half to encourage portion control. You eat slowly because nothing ruins a lure like chewing. Across the room, other concubines do the same, each trying to look casual while also performing a silent, exhausting competition called Who Blinks Least while making eye contact with no one. The servant returns. She suggests a cool compress for your under eyes, which is code for you look like someone just told you the pharaoh prefers harpists. You comply. The cloth smells of lavender and ambition. And so the day begins, not with grandeur, not with glory, but with an endless parade of tiny, effortful rituals designed to make you appear effortlessly divine. You haven't spoken a word yet. You haven't left the room, but you've already fought your first battle, waking up and looking like you haven't aged in the last 12 hours. Spoiler, you'll have to do it again tomorrow. Bath time as a concubine is not about hygiene. It's about transformation. You are not just a woman with sleep crust in her eye. You are a vessel of royal potential. And apparently that vessel needs to be soaked, scrubbed, shaved, and basted like a sacred goose before it's considered presentable. You're led to the bathing chamber, which smells like a perfumery collided with a citrus orchard. The water has been steeped with lotus petals, jasmine oil, and something labeled fragrance of divine intention. It's less of a bath and more of a scented baptism. You're not just rinsing, you're entering the morning's first performance. Two attendants approach with sponges that are both gentle and oddly judgmental.
You're scrubbed with ground natron, a salty mineral powder that exfoliates dead skin, shame, and any remaining memories of village life.
Every inch of you is polished like a ceremonial offering. Then comes the hair removal. Every strand below the eyebrows must vanish. Waxing, plucking, shaving, choose your torment. Body hair is seen as unsightly, unsanitary, and worst of all, common. You grit your teeth as the wax cloth is yanked and remind yourself queens don't complain. They hiss politely. After that, oiling. Thick, rich almond oil is poured over you by someone who speaks only in compliments. You're massaged until your skin gleams and you slip slightly on the floor trying to stand. You've become a human candle. And now the perfume. It's not spritzed, it's layered. First a musky base oil, then a citrus middle note, then a floral top. You smell like a deity or a fruit basket attending a wedding. This scent will cling to you all day, which is the goal. If you pass by the pharaoh and he sneezes, that's not allergies, it's a tactical victory. Finally, you're handed a clean linen shift, semi-transparent naturally, and gently reminded to sit upright for the next hour so the oils can settle with grace. Translation: don't ruin the shine. You are now clean, not because you were dirty, but because expectation demands it. You've completed your ritual. After your ceremonial bath, you enter the next phase of the morning, the assembly of your face. Forget inner beauty. You'll need to earn divine favor with outer cheekbone symmetry and eyeliner so sharp it could be considered a military asset. You're seated in front of a polished bronze mirror, the ancient Egyptian version of a beauty influencer's ring light. A cosmetics attendant approaches, carrying what looks like a miniature painter's kit. Powdered galena, red ochre, crushed carmine beetles. You are about to become a living fresco. First, eyeliner. Black coal is applied with the same seriousness one would expect from a priest handling sacred scrolls. The line must be precise, not too thick, unless you want to look like you're auditioning to be embalmed. Not too thin, lest someone mistake you for a scribe's intern. It's a delicate balance between mystery and menace. You're told to hold still, which is helpful advice if you weren't currently being poked in the eyeball with a reed stick. One tear and the whole thing smudges. Then you'll look weary, and weary women don't get summoned by pharaohs. They get reassigned to linen folding duty. Next comes the lip color. Red ochre mixed with animal fat because nothing says romance like beetle paste chapstick. Your lips must look plump yet humble, which is apparently a real instruction. You try not to overthink it. Then blush, a light dusting across the cheeks to imply youthful vitality. Even though you haven't had a proper night's sleep since the last flood season, high-status fatigue must be masked. You are not allowed to look tired, only pensive. A slave girl steps forward with an eyebrow comb from ivory. Eyebrows are shaped to reflect dignity, fertility, and possibly political allegiance. No one's quite sure anymore. You nod in approval, as if you understand the eyebrow hierarchy. Last comes perfume, again, this time applied behind your ears and on your wrists, because that's where the pharaoh might someday make casual contact, assuming he's bored enough to drop by. You're now beautiful, polished, and possibly flammable. You glance at yourself in the mirror. You look like someone who belongs in a tomb mural offering lotus flowers to a god. All you need now is a god who's hiring. Chapter 1. The Awakening of a Concubine. Once you've been bathed, buffed, oiled, shaved, painted, perfumed, and told you're glowing, but not as much as yesterday, it's time for breakfast. The harem dining hall isn't exactly a bustling mess hall. It's more like a fashion runway where everyone sits down. Dozens of women gather, dressed in semi-sheer linen that whispers, approachable but ambitious. They glide toward their low tables with the precision of a crocodile stalking a heron. Silent, slow, and absolutely sizing each other up. Your meal is elegantly minimal. A small plate of honeyed dates, 2 figs, and a dab of yogurt. Not enough to feed hunger, but just enough to maintain cheekbone structure. You eat gracefully, with 3 fingers only, because apparently forks are still 1,000 years in the future, and gluttony is for widows and scribes. And this is where the passive aggression begins. "Oh, your coal is so bold today," someone coos from across the table, smiling with every tooth except her eyes. You thank her politely while mentally noting that her eyeliner is crooked and her earlobes are uneven. A younger concubine accidentally sits beside you, then loudly mentions how she was up all night practicing harp in case the pharaoh was feeling musical. Translation: she thinks tonight might be her night. You smile, chew slowly, and let a single fig seed sit dramatically on your lip like a statement of war. Conversations swirl around you. Gossip about who cried in the baths, who borrowed whose perfume with asking, who was seen leaving the astrologer's quarters looking hopeful. Everyone's pretending to be unbothered. No one actually is. You make sure not to eat too fast. Women who finish quickly are greedy, and women who don't eat at all are trying too hard. You strike the middle ground, casual elegance with a side of strategic chewing. Servants refill cups of palm wine, but only a splash. Too much, and someone might tell the wrong story to the right person. Breakfast ends with a ceremonial brushing of teeth using a chewed twig and a bit of natron. You smile into your bronze mirror and think, one more meal survived, one more war disguised as brunch. After breakfast, you'd think it might be time to relax, maybe take a nap, maybe do something productive. But no. You are now entering the most exhausting phase of your day, visibly existing in an aesthetically pleasing manner. This is not rest. This is performance art. You're assigned to the relaxation gallery, which sounds lovely until you realize it's a curated space designed for 2 things: looking gorgeous and being seen looking gorgeous. You and 24 other concubines lounge on embroidered cushions arranged to maximize profile angles and minimize shadows. There's no slouching. Posture must imply nobility, fertility, and mild but tasteful boredom. You're allowed to choose your activity as long as it's something ornamental. Reading hieroglyphs aloud is too intellectual. Playing a harp is ideal. Smelling flowers while gazing wistfully at a palm tree is encouraged. Anything that gives off divine but available. If you're exceptionally brave, you might practice accidental elegance, like letting your sandal fall off while stretching, or sighing thoughtfully as if pondering the mysteries of love, politics, or your non-existent pension plan. These are carefully rehearsed micro-dramas designed to be noticed without appearing to want to be noticed. Some of the newer girls try too hard. They strike poses that scream, "Pharaoh, pick me," with the subtlety of a temple gong. These efforts are met with polite applause and immediate whispers. You, however, are experienced. You know the trick isn't to look like you're trying.
The trick is to look like you're being effortlessly ethereal while calculating exactly how much effort it's taking. Every once in a while, a scribe or messenger walks by. You pretend not to notice. You shift ever so slightly into better light. You are a statue pretending to breathe, a lotus in linen. And if by chance word reaches the pharaoh that the third girl on the left had an air of mystique today, then congratulations. Your decorative effort has paid off. You've officially spent 2 hours doing nothing beautifully.
And in this palace, that's not laziness, that's strategy. After you've elegantly existed for an hour or two, posture on point, gaze misty and mysterious, it's time for the educational portion of your day. Don't get too excited. This is not the kind of education that ends in degrees or job offers. This is Concubine School, where the curriculum consists of being interesting enough to hold the pharaoh's attention for 6 minutes without giving him any dangerous ideas about women being clever. You file into a sunlit chamber, where instructors await, draped in scholarly linen and armed with wax tablets. Today's lessons: harp tuning, poetry recitation, and how to tilt your head thoughtfully while discussing dreams. Music is the most respected skill. A concubine who can pluck a harp string just right can practically rearrange court hierarchies. You're taught traditional love songs, all of which include lines like, "My heart blooms like the papyrus reed, and your eyes are more intoxicating than date wine." You're encouraged to mean it, or at least to fake it with appropriate shoulder movement. Poetry follows, not writing it. Heavens no, that's for old men with back problems. You recite it softly, with emotional restraint. You practice saying things like, "The moon weeps for my longing," without giggling, even though everyone knows the moon is too busy controlling tides to care about your relationship status. Sometimes a priest teaches you a few basic hieroglyphs, not too many, just enough to write, "Pharaoh is radiant like Ra," or "I dreamed of lotus blossoms." Anything more complex risks sounding like you have opinions. You're also drilled in mythology, specifically how to compare the pharaoh to various gods without getting the pantheon wrong. Anubis is strength, Thoth is wisdom, Ra is power. Never mix them up unless you want to be remembered as that one girl who called the pharaoh a jackal. At the end of the session, you're quizzed. Not formally, of course. Just tested with subtle questions like, if the king asked you your favorite god, what would you say? Correct answer, whichever one he reminds me of. Your education may not prepare you for the outside world, but if the pharaoh ever asks for a song, a poem, or a well-placed compliment, you'll be ready. Sort of. Now that you've recited enough poetry to qualify as a sentimental statue, it's time for refinement drills. A daily routine designed to make you move like smoke, smile like a goddess, and never ever trip over your own feet in front of royalty. First up, walking practice. Yes, walking. You'd think you mastered that sometime around age 2, but no, not here. In the Haram, walking isn't transportation, it's a performance. You're expected to glide across marble as if your feet barely touch the ground. Unfortunately, your sandals are slippery, the floors are polished, and there's always one girl secretly hoping you fall. To help, your instructor hands you a clay jug filled with water and sets it on your head. The goal: walk the length of the corridor without spilling a drop or developing a lifelong resentment for upper body tension. Every step is a negotiation with gravity and pride. Once you've survived that humiliation, it's time for dance drills. You and the others are arranged in a line and taught to sway like river reeds, but sexier. Arms up, hips loose, but not too loose. You're still supposed to be respectable. You mimic the movements of temple dancers while praying that no one sees your right foot disobey orders. Mistakes are met with constructive criticism. Well, mostly just regular criticism. "You're stiff," says one instructor. "Your rhythm is hesitant," says another. You nod graciously while plotting to stab your own shadow with a hairpin. Then comes the gesture lesson. Concubines don't point, they extend. They don't wave, they fan. Everything must appear effortless, even when your arms have gone numb and your perfume is starting to evaporate.
Next, you're reminded of how to kneel with devotion, but no desperation. The difference, apparently, is all in the eyebrow angle. And finally, you end with voice training. How to speak softly, seductively, and never too quickly. You practice saying, "My lord," 20 different ways, each with a slightly different meaning, ranging from "I am humbled by your greatness" to "Please stop breathing near me." You're sweating, you're sore, and you've achieved precisely 0 things of measurable value. But you walk prettier now, which in this palace is everything. Chapter 2. The Silent Warfare of the Harem. Once your daily regimen of balancing, bowing, and fake sighing concludes, you return to the common rooms, which function as the ancient Egyptian equivalent of a break room. If that break room were filled with silk-clad women locked in a silent war over eye contact and seating arrangements. And here, gossip isn't just a hobby, it's a life skill. In fact, it's arguably the most useful survival tool in the concubine toolkit. Some girls get ahead by dancing, others by smiling. But the truly dangerous ones, they know everything. And more importantly, who else doesn't? You sit near a group of women threading beads. The conversation starts innocently enough. Something about which servant accidentally dropped a fruit bowl in front of the scribe. But within 5 minutes, the topic shifts to who got new jewelry, who was seen leaving the astrologer's room with smudged eyeliner, and who's been mysteriously quiet since last week's sandal fitting. Names are never said directly, only implied. The tall one with the heavy perfume. You know, the girl who always looks like she's about to sneeze. Everyone nods. Everyone knows. The senior concubines don't talk much. They listen, because real gossip isn't just juicy, it's currency. If you know the pharaoh prefers honeyed wine to date wine, that's leverage. If you know which priest his mother doesn't trust, that's insurance. You contribute carefully.
Say too little and you're irrelevant. Say too much and suddenly you've accidentally offended Bastet and find yourself demoted to folding ceremonial napkins. Some of the more experienced women even keep coded wax tablets. Not diaries, mind you, but tactical observation logs. A spreadsheet of betrayal, envy, and who coughed during the harp solo. And of course, there's the double gossip. When someone tells you a secret about someone who already told you that same secret, that's when things get interesting. That's when you start playing palace chess. You never gossip directly about the pharaoh, that's suicide. But about the other concubines, it's not just allowed, it's expected. You're doing your civic duty, really. By the end of the hour, you've learned more than in poetry class, and you've made eye contact with 3 potential future enemies. Success.
After your morning of posturing, powdering, and palace espionage, it's time to settle in for the highlight of every concubine's day. The long, suspenseful wait to maybe, possibly be summoned by the pharaoh. Now, let's be clear, he probably won't come. He's likely busy inspecting irrigation plans, overseeing construction projects, or listening to court musicians with names like Henu the Flatulent. But that doesn't matter, because you still have to act like he might. You're led to the waiting chamber, a gilded room filled with cushions, incense, and women sitting in the same 3 poses. Serene but alluring, restful yet radiant, and desperately pretending not to care. You pick a spot near the window so the natural light hits your cheekbones just right. Not that you've practiced this or anything. A servant enters. All heads subtly turn. Is she here to summon someone? No, she's refilling the fruit bowl. Still, a moment of electric tension passes as you wonder if your grape placement was regal enough. You shift positions every 15 minutes not to get comfortable.
Comfort is forbidden, but to keep your limbs from going numb in the event you're summoned and expected to glide like moonlight, you also practice looking surprised but grateful in case your name is actually spoken aloud. Some girls hum softly, others read love poems they wrote themselves, which is both tragic and brave. One girl is quietly plucking at her lute, like she's serenading fate itself. You sip wine, pretend not to judge her, and mentally edit her lyrics for better rhyme. Hours pass. A breeze stirs the linen curtains. Somewhere down the corridor, a sandal slaps against stone. Everyone freezes. Then silence. False alarm. Someone was just heading to the latrine. You exhale politely. Inside, your soul does a small scream. Eventually, a servant does appear and calls someone else's name. There's a ripple of forced enthusiasm. You smile as if thrilled for her. She floats past, smug and barefoot, smelling like victory and rose oil. You're left with your thoughts, your carefully posed limbs, and the lingering smell of disappointment. He didn't visit today, but he might tomorrow. And so you stay, beautiful, poised, and hopelessly prepared for a man who probably doesn't remember what you sound like. If the pharaoh's harem were a garden, it wouldn't be one of those peaceful lotus ponds poets write about. No, it's more like a perfectly trimmed hedge maze filled with smiling tigers. Every concubine here is sweet, perfumed, and actively plotting. You quickly learn that power here doesn't come from beauty alone. Everyone's beautiful. That's the entry fee. What actually counts? Alliances, influence, and the ability to say, "You look radiant," while thinking, "I hope your eyeliner melts." Some girls form tight little cliques, usually centered around whoever had a confirmed evening audience last week. These groups are part gossip club, part spy network, and part human chess game. Joining one is like marrying into a noble house. You gain protection, status, and lifelong suspicion. Then there are the floaters like you, the quiet observers, the ones who smile at everyone and trust no one. You listen more than you speak. You compliment more than you confess, and you always, always pretend you didn't hear what you definitely heard. Smiling is your most used tool. There's the polite smile, the supportive smile, the passive-aggressive smile, and the "thank you for that completely unnecessary comment" smile. You rotate between them like a seasoned diplomat. Some of the senior concubines have mastered what's known as the invisible war, where no insults are ever spoken, but entire careers are ruined through praise that's just a little too specific. Oh, of course, she was chosen. The pharaoh always liked women who looked maternal. Occasionally, a new girl tries to be sincere. She opens up, shares her past, asks for advice. This usually ends with her being emotionally flattened by breakfast the next morning. Lesson learned. You discover that maintaining neutral alliances is an art form. Compliment one girl too often and you're her servant. Compliment two and you're a traitor. Compliment none and you're distant. Best to compliment the cat, honestly. And through it all you smile, because smiling hides worry. Smiling buys time. Smiling convinces everyone, including yourself, that you're still in the game. Even if you're just another piece being moved. Nothing changes the mood of the harem like the sudden arrival of the great royal wife. A title that means you may all be lovely, but I'm the one whose jewelry gets its own chariot. She doesn't visit often. Frankly, she doesn't have to. Her presence lingers like myrrh and suppressed ambition. But when she does walk in, the room goes from polite rivalry to absolute emotional lockdown in 3 seconds. You don't hear her coming, you feel her like an approaching sandstorm in silk. Conversation evaporates. Figs stop mid-air. Everyone suddenly remembers to cross their ankles, adjust their posture, and pretend to be fascinated by the nearest houseplant. And then she appears. She's older than most of you, which in concubine terms means she's seen a lot. She walks like someone who's been walking past nervous girls in expensive linen for the past 20 years. Her kohl is darker, her headdress taller. Her smile, a study in regal threat management. She makes slow, deliberate eye contact with each of you. No words, just that faint, amused expression that says, I know which of you thinks you're clever. I also know which of you cried in the bath last week. She doesn't need to raise her voice. When she speaks, it's usually something terrifyingly vague, like, I do hope the younger women are behaving with wisdom. No names, no accusations, just enough suggestion to cause a small emotional collapse in 3 corners of the room. You offer your most respectful smile, the one you save for women who could have you reassigned to weaving duty without blinking. She nods slightly. Success. You are for today beneath notice, which is a win. Some girls try to impress her. They perform subtle acts of grace, retelling a myth, adjusting a flower vase just so, complimenting her choice of anklet like it's a sacred relic. She humors them. She's seen it all because she was you once, but she played the game better, and she won. Then, just as suddenly, she leaves, gliding out of the room like a vision in gold. No one breathes for 10 seconds. Then, slowly, conversations resume. Softer, more careful. The Queen has walked in and reminded everyone what power really looks like. Chapter 3. The Education and Refinement of a Royal Asset. As the sun sets over the palace walls and casts a golden glow over the Nile, the atmosphere inside the harem shifts. Perfume is reapplied, hair is retied, linen is straightened. Because as darkness creeps in, so does possibility, and with it an elegant form of emotional torment known as maybe tonight. You've spent all day being polished, painted, and perfectly polite. Now you wait again. But this time the stakes feel higher. This isn't about being seen, it's about being chosen. Maybe the pharaoh will send a servant, maybe not. The only certainty is the tension in the air and the faint smell of rose oil and ambition. The younger concubines pretend not to care. They hum softly, rehearse harp melodies, or casually mention they had dreams involving royal cobras and marriage. The older ones, wiser, sharper, simply sit back and sip their wine.
They've played this game too long to show their hand now. You, of course, do what all smart women do at dusk in ancient Egypt. You smile vaguely and try not to look like you're rehearsing your surprised but thrilled reaction in your head. The servant enters. Everyone goes still. She clears her throat. Names are never shouted. They're whispered like sacred chants. If it's yours, you rise gracefully, as if the moment hadn't consumed your thoughts all day. If it's not, you keep your face pleasant and sip your wine like it doesn't suddenly taste like despair. Tonight, it's not your name. You nod, smile, and offer an encouraging look to the girl who was called, even as your own confidence quietly crawls under a cushion and weeps. But the show must go on. You remove your jewelry. You unpaint your face. You bathe again, though this time it's more about washing off hope than sweat. You slip into your night linen and curl onto your mat, pretending you're grateful for the quiet. Above you, the moon hangs full and indifferent. Somewhere, music drifts from the upper chambers. You tell yourself, maybe tomorrow, because that's what keeps you here. Not certainty, but the ritual of not knowing. And in this place, uncertainty is the most intoxicating drug of all.
As the palace slips into silence and the oil lamps burn low, the harem enters its most secretive and absurd realm. Dream time, where ambitions bloom unchecked and reality politely excuses itself. You lie on your mat, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The linen above you shifts in the breeze like a lazy ghost. Around you, other concubines murmur quietly, sharing the strange visions they've had lately. Walking on lotus petals, pharaohs with lion heads, birds that speak in riddles. It's all very poetic and only mildly insane. But here's the thing. In this palace, dreams matter. A well-timed dream can shift your standing more than all the perfume in Thebes. Interpret the right symbols, and suddenly you're not just a concubine. You're a vessel of divine wisdom. Misinterpret them, and you're the girl who claimed Ra wanted her to lead a poetry recital. You keep your own dream journal. It's a cracked papyrus scroll tucked under your mattress. You write things like, flooded courtyard, symbolic of emotional repression, or Pharaoh smiled at me, then turned into a fish. Less clear. If you ever find a priest who likes metaphors, this thing could catapult you into real influence, or at least better seating at breakfast. Sometimes dreams are shared strategically. One girl recently dreamt she saw the queen offering her lotus blossoms. Everyone knows it didn't happen, but now she gets invited to the queen's embroidery circle. That's the power of fabricated sleep visions. They're deniable and useful. You dream too, of rising, of being more than decorative, of having your own estate, of whispering advice to the pharaoh and him actually listening. Occasionally you dream of just leaving, but then you remember. Outside the palace there are fields, sandstorms, and husbands who chew with their mouths open. Inside there's at least the illusion of opportunity. You roll over and whisper your latest dream to your friend. It involved a cat walking backward and offering you a crown. She nods like that's perfectly normal. "Definitely Bastet," she says. "Power is coming." You both pretend to believe it, because here dreams are currency. Papyrus is cheap, and hope, however delusional, is the only luxury that's free. By your 14th bath and 29th fig, you start wondering what exactly is freedom. It's a word whispered sometimes, not often, and never loudly, by the older concubines, usually after too much wine. They'll look off toward the distant hills and mutter things like, "I remember when I could walk to the market alone," or "Once I picked my own hairstyle." And you'll nod respectfully while trying to picture a life where your biggest decision wasn't which incense blend to wear at dusk. On paper, you live in unimaginable luxury. Silk, music, security, and meals that don't involve scraping dates off the ground. But in practice, you have fewer choices than a basket of lentils. Want to leave the palace? That's adorable. You belong to it now. You are technically not a prisoner, but try walking past those guards with your eyeliner slightly smudged and see how far you get. Want to marry? Only if the pharaoh forgets you exist long enough to permit it, which ironically feels less like rejection and more like parole. Want to raise your voice? Only if it's in a love song or a gentle prayer for the Nile to flood favorably. Your job is to be admired, not heard. Your opinions are as ornamental as your bracelets, pretty but strictly non-functional. And yet, within this well-stitched cage, some women do find a strange kind of freedom. Not physical freedom, of course, don't be silly, but emotional, political, social freedom. The ability to influence which poem is recited at court, to suggest a priest be consulted, to whisper something to the Queen's cousin that somehow changes the menu for a royal feast. It's not much, but it's something. You think about the village girl you used to be, chasing goats, sunburned, covered in dust. She was free in the can go outside sense, yes. But now you're free in the knows how to manipulate 3 noble families without lifting a finger sense. Is that better? You're not sure. But you do know that freedom here is never given. It's performed like everything else. And the better your performance, the less anyone questions whether you're free at all. One day, you won't be here anymore. Maybe you'll be replaced by someone younger with shinier hair and better loot skills. Maybe the pharaoh will lose interest entirely and take up falconry full-time. Or maybe you'll be quietly reassigned to a country villa where you'll spend your days sipping diluted wine and reminiscing about the time you almost got summoned but didn't because the Queen's cousin had a headache. And then comes the real question, the one no one asks out loud. Will anyone remember you? You won't have a statue. Statues are for gods, generals, and men who invented new types of plows. Your name might appear in a court ledger somewhere. Line 34, extra lotus oil for concubine, name illegible. That's your grand historical footprint. The scribes won't write songs about you unless you die tragically young and poetically near a fountain. But even then, someone else will probably get the credit. Still, you hope. You hope the Queen remembers you as the one with the steady hands or that girl who never flinched during eyeliner application. You hope one of the younger concubines imitates your posture one day without realizing it. You hope a servant whispers, "She once made the pharaoh laugh," like it means something. Maybe that's all legacy really is, a few scattered memories drifting through someone else's afternoon. But on certain nights, especially the ones when the air smells like myrrh and the moonlight hits the courtyard just right, you let yourself imagine more. Maybe your name will end up in a forgotten scroll. Maybe a modern scholar will read it centuries later and wonder who you were.
Maybe they'll mispronounce it, publish a theory, or turn you into an exhibit with poor lighting and a misspelled plaque. Still, it's something because you were here. You outlasted rivals. You mastered posture, deception, poetry, and staying silent in 5 languages. You turned obedience into performance and hope into strategy. You lived in a palace, even if it wasn't really yours.
And in a world where most women never left the mud brick walls of their village, you became a whisper in the palace of kings. Maybe that's not immortality, but it's close enough. Chapter 4. The Ceremonial Bedding, Medieval Marriage as Public Spectacle. The feast is over. The music has faded. The nobles have loosened their belts and unfastened their shoes. But for the bride and groom, the most humiliating and crucial part of the day is just beginning. In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't sealed with a kiss. It was sealed with witnesses, sheets, and often a whole room of in-laws. The bedding ceremony, as it was called, was less a celebration of love and more a legal performance, one that turned the bedroom into a courtroom and the bed into the final contract. You see, in the medieval world, sex wasn't just personal, it was political. A noble family needed heirs, and heirs required proof. So after the wedding feast, the entire community, or at least the most nosy and powerful members, would accompany the newlyweds to their chambers, and they wouldn't stop at the door. They'd come in. If you were lucky, they might just remove your shoes, offer a toast, or sing a bawdy song before leaving you to it. If you were less fortunate, they might stick around long enough to see you naked, inspect the bedcloths, or cheer you on with mocking advice and drunken encouragement. Some families even required a bishop or midwife to inspect the bride beforehand, or the sheets afterward, for signs that the deed had been done. Why the intrusion? Because marriages weren't private unions. They were public contracts. A noblewoman's virginity was political capital. A nobleman's ability to consummate was a legal obligation. Without a consummation, the marriage could be annulled, and without witnesses, it was your word against the world's. It didn't matter if the bride was trembling, or the groom was drunk, or both were strangers to one another. What mattered was that someone saw, or claimed to see, the beginning of their conjugal union. And if they didn't, the marriage might not count. In this strange twilight between feast and consummation, the couple's private life began as public spectacle. Their first night together wasn't about intimacy or joy, it was about proof, and often that proof came with an audience. And that, dear viewer, was just the beginning of the ceremony. Once the final toast had been raised and the last course cleared, the newlyweds weren't given privacy. They were given an entourage. Servants, family members, priests, and even minstrels formed a procession to escort the couple to their marital bed. And this wasn't some quiet, respectful send-off. It was a raucous theatrical parade, often loud, occasionally lewd, and completely devoid of subtlety. The groom might be half carried, half dragged by his friends, already red in the face from too much wine or dread. The bride, in contrast, was often pale, silent, and escorted by her female relatives, whose job it was to ensure she didn't bolt or faint. If she was a noblewoman, this was her debut as property. If she was a peasant, it was still a public performance of modesty and obedience. Either way, it was theatre, and everyone had a role to play. And the music? Oh yes, there was often music. Not sweet romantic violins, mind you. Drums, pipes, and the occasional crude song shouted in rhythm with each step. In France, they called it the charivari, a rowdy, mocking serenade meant to embarrass the couple and encourage a successful union. Think medieval hazing with a religious blessing. Upon reaching the bedchamber, the couple didn't simply step inside and close the door. Instead, they were ceremoniously undressed, often by relatives or attendants. The groom might be stripped down by his groomsmen. The bride, gently, or not so gently, disrobed by her maids or matrons. Every layer removed wasn't just fabric, it was symbolic. Childhood gone, autonomy gone.
Now you belong to each other, or more accurately, to the family alliance. In some regions, a priest or bishop gave a final blessing over the bed, as if holiness could somehow sterilize the awkwardness. In others, a cup of wine or spiced milk was passed between the couple, a last comfort before the main act. And the witnesses, they might not leave just yet. Some stayed behind the curtain, some stood near the door. A few particularly determined ones waited outside the room with ears pressed to the wood. In short, this was no gentle stroll to privacy. It was a forced march into adulthood, carried on a wave of cheers, songs, and uninvited eyes. And the worst part, the night had only just begun. If you were hoping the crowd would discreetly exit and let the couple awkwardly find their rhythm in peace, think again. In many medieval regions, the concept of privacy during a wedding night was practically non-existent. The entire point of the bedding ceremony was to prove consummation, and in a world where land, power, and alliances were passed down through bloodlines, that proof had to be irrefutable, even if it meant peeking through curtains or literally sitting in the corner of the room. Let's be clear, not all witnesses were intrusive. In some traditions, nobles or village elders might only escort the couple to the bed, remove a shoe, tuck in the covers, say a prayer, and then leave. Symbolic enough to count. But in other cases, the situation took a turn from symbolic to straight-up voyeuristic. Certain royal courts demanded clerics, midwives, or matrons to remain in the room just in case anything went wrong or didn't happen at all. Some nobles even went so far as to appoint official witnesses who would later sign written attestations of consummation. These weren't just casual guests, these were notaries of the night. The implication was clear: you weren't alone, and you weren't allowed to fake it. It gets worse. There are accounts, yes, real ones, of high-born wedding nights where courtiers or family members would listen for specific sounds, watch for movements under the sheets, or even inspect the bed sheets the next morning for signs of deflowering. Blood-stained linen, proof of virginity and honor. A clean sheet, cause for scandal and annulment. And if the bride was suspected of being less than pure, the pressure doubled. She might be questioned, examined, or even accused of witchcraft if things didn't go as expected. The groom didn't escape scrutiny either. If he failed to perform, especially in noble families, it could trigger lawsuits, church inquiries, or diplomatic embarrassment. Of course, not every ceremony reached this level of absurdity. Peasants might have had a slightly more relaxed experience, often sending guests away after a few crude jokes and toasts. But in elite circles where bloodlines were currency, failure to consummate publicly or believably could collapse entire dynastic plans. So imagine lying in a cold room next to someone you barely know, with the faint sound of whispering relatives outside the door, and realizing your first act of intimacy is being treated like courtroom evidence. The door may have closed. The guests may have stepped out, some reluctantly. But for the newlyweds, the real ceremony was just beginning, and calling it romantic would be laughably generous. For many brides, especially noble women, this was a moment of intense dread. The wedding night wasn't about affection.
It was about obligation, and often it was their first sexual experience. Groom, stranger, setting, alien, consent. Technically implied, but practically irrelevant. The whole experience was wrapped in pressure, performance, and fear. A misstep, a flinch, a failure. It could all unravel the family's plans. The bed itself was the stage. In noble households, it wasn't just any bed. It was ornately carved, placed in a special chamber, and often set aside for this one event. It might have symbolic decorations, pomegranates for fertility, lilies for purity, even religious icons nailed to the headboard, just in case divine intervention was needed to get things going. And while the couple may have been alone now, their minds were anything but private. The weight of expectations hung heavy. Produce an heir. Prove your masculinity. Bleed for your virtue. Finish the job. The groom was expected to claim his bride. The bride was expected to endure it, no matter how painful, awkward, or terrifying it was. She was trained for modesty and silence. He was expected to be aggressive and efficient. For some couples, things went smoothly, or as smoothly as possible in a cold, high-pressure environment. Others weren't so lucky. The groom might be too drunk, too nervous, or too inexperienced to do anything at all. The bride might cry, freeze, or recoil. And if the night ended without success, that failure would echo for months, if not years. In fact, there were recorded cases where kings and nobles were humiliated for their inability to consummate their marriages. It wasn't just a bedroom issue. It became a matter of national gossip and political weakness. Entire annulments were justified based on the absence of consummation, and the evidence, witnesses, rumors, and those all-important sheets. The bed wasn't a place of comfort. It was a battlefield of duty, performance, and generational expectation. And for many, it left psychological scars far deeper than any physical ones. Chapter 5.
The Aftermath and Anatomy of Failure. Bedding Ceremony Consequences. If you thought the worst part of the medieval bedding ceremony ended at the threshold of the bedchamber, think again. Come morning, the real fun began for everyone except the newlyweds. The first rays of daylight didn't just bring fresh air and chirping birds. They brought expectations, proof, evidence, gossip. In many noble households, the sheets were more important than the vows. And yes, someone was definitely coming to collect them. Enter the bed inspector. This could be a midwife, a chambermaid, or in royal circles, a high-ranking female relative. Their job to examine the sheets for blood. Evidence that the bride had been a virgin and the marriage had been honorably consummated. Spot of red, congratulations. No stain, that's a problem. Now let's pause for a second. Virginity is not, medically speaking, a reliable thing to prove. The idea that all women bleed their first time is a myth. But tell that to a medieval father-in-law trying to secure his land inheritance. In his eyes, no blood meant no virtue. No virtue meant fraud, and fraud could invalidate a marriage. So yes, failure to produce the right kind of sheet could trigger serious consequences. Accusations of deception, public humiliation, sometimes even an annulment. It was a rigged system, and the woman bore the weight of its failure. But even if the sheet passed inspection, the ordeal wasn't over. The couple was expected to appear together before the community or court. This appearance often included breakfast in bed, delivered by servants with smug smiles and knowing glances. Imagine sitting up bleary-eyed, trying to sip watered-down wine, while nobles smirked and passed judgment on your night's performance. In smaller villages, peasants might greet the couple with lewd songs or fertility dances. Think of it like a hangover wrapped in forced applause. No matter your social class, the unspoken question was the same. Did you do it?
And more importantly, did you do it correctly? And let's not forget the gossip. Servants talked, relatives whispered, even the priest might hint at things during his sermon. One awkward glance or offhand comment could set rumors in motion for years. Not all wedding nights ended with blood-stained sheets and satisfied in-laws. Sometimes things went badly, and in the rigid framework of medieval society, a failed bedding ceremony wasn't just awkward, it could be catastrophic. First, there was the issue of non-consummation. If the groom couldn't perform due to nerves, drink, or sheer inexperience, the consequences were swift. Whispers would start before the couple even emerged from the room. A red-faced groom was bad enough. A frustrated, tear-streaked bride, worse. By breakfast, the rumors had already lapped the castle walls. In some cases, the issue became a matter of public inquiry. Yes, public. Noble families with political alliances on the line couldn't risk ambiguity. If a prince couldn't consummate, that was not just a bedroom issue, it was a dynastic threat. Courts might call on midwives, physicians, and even clergy to test the groom's virility. In France and England, there were actual court cases where grooms were ordered to publicly prove their manhood. One unfortunate nobleman in the 16th century had to submit to a full investigation, complete with witness testimony and physical examination, all because his bride said nothing had happened. On the bride's side, failure to bleed could lead to accusations of prior impurity. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. The stain was on her reputation, and her family's honor hung in the balance. Some desperate women resorted to faking the evidence, using animal blood or pricking their own fingers to stain the sheets. A risky tactic, but sometimes the only option. Then came the worst-case scenario, annulment. If the marriage wasn't consummated, the church could declare it invalid.
That meant the dowry might be returned, alliances broken, and the woman labelled damaged goods. For noble women, this could spell exile to a convent. For commoners, it meant public shame and social demotion. And in rare but real cases, violence followed. An enraged groom, humiliated and desperate to defend his honor, might accuse his wife of witchcraft, deception, or adultery. Women were beaten, imprisoned, or worse, all because of a failed expectation. What began as a ceremony of union could thus end in separation, scandal, or even punishment. The bedding ceremony was never just about sex. It was a public trial of bodies and reputations. And when the trial failed, it left wreckage behind. While the general concept of the bedding ceremony appeared across much of medieval Europe, the way it played out varied wildly from region to region. Each culture added its own flavor, some just awkward, others downright bizarre. In Scandinavia, for instance, the ceremony often involved the bride being carried, sometimes upside down, across the threshold of the bedchamber, symbolizing her transition from maidenhood to marriage. In more rural traditions, the groom's friends might try to sabotage the consummation by playing pranks, singing loudly, or even locking him out of the room as a joke. Brotherhood had its limits. Apparently, in Germany, it wasn't uncommon for the bedding to involve an actual bed race. Yes, a bed with wheels dragged through the village with the newlyweds on it, while neighbors banged pots and pans in celebration or mockery. The more noise, the better. It was believed to ward off evil spirits and subtlety. In Ireland, a more symbolic practice took place. While the bedding was still expected, the public part often stopped at the chamber door. But older women of the village might hover nearby, ready to offer fertility charms, advice, or less comfortingly, a critique of the bride's childbearing hips.
Meanwhile, in France, the bedding was more of a legal spectacle. In royal courts, the bride and groom might sign documents in bed, with clergy present to sanctify the act. And in particularly dramatic ceremonies, nobles would pull the bed curtain shut with a flourish, as if drawing the curtain on a play, which in many ways it was. Spain, on the other hand, leaned heavily into Catholic symbolism. A crucifix might be placed above the bed, with prayers recited before any physical act occurred. The Church wanted to remind you this was not just passion, it was duty blessed by God. Passion, of course, was optional. And among peasants, things were generally more relaxed, though still public. A village might follow the couple home with torches, sing songs outside the door, or even sneak up to bang on the shutters mid-act. Romance? No. Communal entertainment? Absolutely. No matter where you were, one thing was consistent. The bedding ceremony was never just for the couple. It was for the family, the village, the church, and the law. The sheets might have varied, the songs might have changed, but the awkwardness, that was universal. As strange and structured as the medieval bedding ceremony was, it existed in a world full of contradictions. It was sacred and crude, formal and farcical, deadly serious yet oddly comedic. And among all the rules, rituals, and superstitions, there existed an entire undercurrent of unspoken behaviors, things everyone knew but no one ever said aloud. For instance, everyone knew the groom might be terrified. Sure, masculinity was prized, but not every young man came to the bedchamber with confidence or experience. If he failed to rise to the occasion, it was quietly blamed on nerves, or too much wine, or even sorcery. Wives were told to be patient, or discreet, or both. The bride, on the other hand, was expected to be silent, modest, and still. But behind closed doors she might weep, plead, or simply freeze. As strange and structured as the medieval bedding ceremony was, it existed in a world full of contradictions. It was sacred and crude, formal and farcical, deadly serious yet oddly comedic. And among all the rules, rituals, and superstitions, there existed an entire undercurrent of unspoken behaviors, things everyone knew but no one ever said aloud. For instance, everyone knew the groom might be terrified. Sure, masculinity was prized, but not every young man came to the bedchamber with confidence or experience. If he failed to rise to the occasion, it was quietly blamed on nerves, or too much wine, or even sorcery. Wives were told to be patient, or discreet, or both. The bride, on the other hand, was expected to be silent, modest, and still. But behind closed doors she might weep, plead, or simply freeze.
These were taboo topics, never spoken about during morning gossip or courtly banter, but well known to mothers, nurses, and the older women tasked with preparing her. And then there was the humour, because of course there was humour. The medieval world wasn't always grim and grey. It had room for mockery and mischief. The bedding ceremony was ripe for it. Drunken friends might swap the groom's nightshirt for a woman's robe. A chamber pot might be hidden beneath the covers. In some regions, guests tied bells to the bed so everyone would know exactly when the deed was done. It was crude, yes, but also a release valve for a ritual so tense it could snap. Even priests sometimes got in on the joke, offering blessings with the thinnest of veils over double meanings. A line like, "May this union bear fruit in due season," wasn't always said with a straight face. Then there were the unspoken strategies. A nervous groom might rehearse with a prostitute weeks before the wedding night. A terrified bride might receive secret herbs to calm her nerves or dull the pain. Midwives had entire toolkits of tips, from scented oils to gentle distractions. These things weren't written into law, but they passed down through generations like whispered recipes. In short, the bedding ceremony wasn't just a rigid ritual. It was a chaotic dance of pageantry, pressure, and pretense. Beneath the surface of formality lived fear, humor, empathy, and a desperate hope that someone, anyone, had done this before. Chapter 6: The Gritty Reality of Medieval Dental Suffering. If you lived in medieval Europe and had a toothache, you were already in trouble. Because in this world, dental care didn't exist. Not in any form we'd recognize. Your teeth were on their own. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, no floss. No idea what bacteria was. The mouth was just another hole in your face. And if something went wrong in there, you dealt with it the same way you dealt with every other kind of pain.
By gritting your teeth and praying to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of dental agony. The average medieval diet didn't help. Bread was coarse and often mixed with ground-up bits of stone from poorly milled flour. Meat was common but rarely fresh, and vegetables were boiled into oblivion. Sugar wasn't yet the enemy. It was barely even on the scene in most parts of Europe. But decay still came fast. By your mid-20s, your smile likely resembled a haunted graveyard. Crooked, yellow, and missing several key residents. If you developed a cavity, it wouldn't be cleaned. It would fester. The pain would start as a dull ache, then become sharp and constant. Infection could swell your jaw, cloud your thinking, and in the worst cases, kill you. Yes, kill you. Dental abscesses could become fatal when the infection spread into the bloodstream or the brain. But nobody understood that back then. If you died, people assumed it was divine punishment, not bacteria eating you alive from the inside. To soothe the pain, you might be offered a poultice of mashed herbs. If you had a little money, perhaps a honey and vinegar rinse, sweet, acidic, and completely ineffective. You might even be told to hold a hot poker near your cheek to draw out the evil humors. At best, these were distractions. At worst, they made the infection worse. Eventually, someone, probably your mother, your priest, or your local village wise woman, would look at you and say, "It has to come out." And that was the medieval solution to nearly every dental problem. Extraction, not repair, not healing. Just pull it and pray. And that's where things got interesting, because in the absence of real dentists, the job of yanking your rotten molars fell to people whose qualifications, well, let's say, flexible. In the medieval world, if you wanted a tooth pulled, your options were limited, and none of them came with a license. You didn't go to a dentist. That word didn't even exist. Instead, you walked into the shop of the local barber surgeon, a man who might give you a haircut, lance a boil, amputate your leg, and rip out your molar all before lunch. Barber surgeons were the working-class doctors of the day. They weren't university educated. They didn't study anatomy with monks or debate Galenic theory in Latin. They learned on the job, often apprenticing under other barbers who taught them two essential things: how to sharpen blades and how to keep a person alive long enough to charge them afterward. Tooth extractions were considered minor surgery, something messy, painful, and beneath the dignity of university-trained physicians. So barbers took over. Their tools were basic but terrifying: iron forceps, long-handled pliers, curved hooks, and in some cases their bare fingers. None of them were sanitized. If you were lucky, the tools were wiped on a rag between patients. If you weren't, they were still sticky with someone else's blood. There was no anesthesia. A barber surgeon might offer you a stiff drink, a leather strap to bite down on, or a prayer. You sat in a chair or just stood still and hoped your nerves held. Some barbers worked quickly, yanking the offending tooth in one brutal motion. Others needed several tries. If the tooth broke off mid-pull, they'd dig out the roots with a hooked instrument. This, unsurprisingly, caused screaming, flailing, and fainting. But barber surgeons weren't just butchers. Many took pride in their craft. Some became so well known for their dental work that they traveled from village to village like rock stars of oral misery. They'd set up in market squares with signs advertising their skills. A popular technique was to display recently extracted teeth on a string or nail them to the post, proof of experience if not hygiene. Did the patients complain? Rarely, because in the medieval mind, the pain of a rotten tooth was worse than anything a man with pliers could do. And besides, if your barber botched the job, there wasn't exactly a dental malpractice board to file a complaint with. Not every medieval person waited for their teeth to rot out before doing something about it. There were attempts, strange, gritty, often questionable attempts at keeping the mouth clean. And the centerpiece of medieval oral care, tooth powder. Forget your sleek tube of minty toothpaste. Medieval tooth powder came in little ceramic jars or pouches made of linen. The recipes varied wildly depending on region, wealth, and how desperate you were. But common ingredients included crushed bones, burnt bread crusts, powdered herbs, and ashes. Some added crushed oyster shells, pumice stone, or charcoal for extra abrasion. In short, it was like scrubbing your teeth with sandpaper and calling it self-care. The powders were applied with a rag, a finger, or, if you were wealthy, a rudimentary toothbrush made from twigs or hog bristles. No one really understood the concept of bacteria or tooth enamel, so the goal wasn't to kill germs, it was to scrape away grime and improve your breath. If your mouth smelled like death, you were probably considered unlucky, sinful, or French. Mint, sage, rosemary, and salt were popular additions, not for hygiene, but for scent. They masked the odor of decay and made it slightly more pleasant to be in kissing distance. The upper class might import exotic spices like cinnamon or clove, crushed and mixed into their powders. For peasants, old soot and bone dust would do. Then there was honey. Yes, honey. Some medical texts actually recommended filling cavities with it based on the logic that honey was naturally antimicrobial, which it is, but also sticky and packed with sugar. So the end result was like stuffing a wound with syrup. It may have calmed the pain temporarily, but it also accelerated the decay. And yet it was still one of the better ideas they had. Some remedies ventured into the absurd. Powdered mouse skulls, boiled dog's milk, and even urine rinses were touted by certain quack physicians as cures for toothache. Did they work? Of course not. But when your gums were throbbing and your jaw was swelling, you'd try just about anything. In short, medieval oral care was less about prevention and more about survival. If your breath didn't kill your social life, the powder probably just wore your enamel down to the nerve. But hey, at least you tried. Chapter 7. The Nomadic Table. Feasting, War, and Diplomacy in the Mongol Empire. When medieval medicine failed, and it often did, people turned to the next best solution: magic, religion, or both. Because if crushed bone powder and honey-stuffed cavities couldn't fix the problem, maybe God or a charm tucked under your pillow could. Toothache in the medieval mind wasn't always caused by bad hygiene. It could be punishment for sin, the work of a malevolent spirit, or even the result of toothworms. Yes, worms. Many people genuinely believed that little squirming creatures burrowed into their teeth and gnawed away at the roots. Some swore they saw them. Others believed the sound of pain, the throbbing, was actually the worms wriggling inside. To treat these imaginary invaders, you could try smoking them out.
One common folk remedy involved blowing hot vapor from burning henbane seeds directly into the mouth. The idea, the worms would flee from the heat and die. More likely, your gums would just blister and your bad breath would turn lethal. Then there were toothache charms, often written on parchment and worn around the neck. Latin prayers, astrological symbols, or even nonsense scribbles were believed to carry healing power. If the charm failed, you could always invoke Saint Apollonia, the martyr who had all her teeth pulled out and became the patron saint of dental sufferers. Her image was carried in pockets, carved into church walls, or worn on amulets by people clutching their cheeks in agony.
The Church, for its part, tried to walk the line between superstition and salvation. Monks often acted as doctors in monasteries, offering herbal remedies and prayers in equal measure. Some medieval medical texts written by clergy advised fasting and confession as a way to purify the humours and ease tooth pain. Others simply told you to offer a mass and hope for divine mercy. For wealthier patients, the Church sometimes offered holy relics for healing: a bone fragment from a saint, a vial of blessed oil, or a sliver of the true cross. Just place it near the sore tooth and wait. You might still die of sepsis, but you die feeling spiritually clean. At the end of the day, when no powders, pliers, or prayers worked, the medieval mouth became a battlefield between faith and infection, one where neither side had a particularly good track record. In the medieval world, pain wasn't something to be avoided, it was something to be endured, like bad weather or your in-laws. There were no anesthetics, no Novocaine, and certainly no soothing ocean soundtracks piped in during treatment. Pain was expected. In some ways, it was even respected. Tooth extraction wasn't a quiet clinical affair, it was a public performance of agony. Picture this. You're slumped in a wobbly wooden chair, cheeks swollen, your mouth open, while a man in a blood-stained apron rummages around with iron tongs. There's no sedative, no sterilization, maybe a gulp of strong wine if you could afford it, maybe a prayer if you couldn't. The barber surgeon would grip the offending tooth and pull, twist, or wedge it out. If it broke, which it often did, they'd keep digging. The pain could be so intense that people fainted or vomited. Some bit clean through their own lips, trying not to scream. Others were physically restrained by assistants or relatives, and still they came. Because as bad as the procedure was, the pain of a rotting tooth was worse. Some barber surgeons took pride in minimizing suffering. They worked fast, confidently, like medieval cowboys of the jaw. Others were just winging it. There are records of teeth being shattered, jaws dislocated, or entire chunks of gum torn out. If the wound got infected afterward, and it often did, you simply lived with it or didn't. Even more grim, some dentists claimed to treat multiple patients in a row using the same unwashed tools. No boiling, no wiping, not even a rinse. One mouth's bacteria passed to the next like a cursed relay baton. The concept of cross-contamination didn't exist yet. And if you were unlucky enough to develop a post-extraction abscess, you could find yourself back in the same chair, this time begging for someone to lance the swelling with a knife. So why didn't more people just tough it out? Because the pain of doing nothing often became unbearable. And in an age when prayer, honey, and powdered bone dust couldn't help, ripping the tooth out by force was the only option left. And pain, that was just part of the price of survival. No numbing, no apologies, just iron and willpower and a bucket for the blood. Not every dental horror took place in a dark back room. In fact, some of the loudest screams came from the village square, right between the sausage vendor and the man selling geese. That's because many medieval extractions happened out in the open, courtesy of travelling tooth pullers. These weren't trained professionals. They were showmen, itinerant peddlers, who moved from town to town, setting up makeshift stalls at fairs and market days. They wore flamboyant clothes, carried massive sets of pliers, and claimed to cure every ailment from toothache to heartbreak. Some even had fake credentials, scrolls in Latin no one could read, or blessed instruments covered in fake gold leaf. Their strategy was simple: attract a crowd, create a spectacle, and yank some teeth. They'd start with a loud pitch, boasting of their miracle cures and gentle hands.
Sometimes they used a planted assistant, someone who pretended to have a toothache and was cured on the spot. The crowd, eager for free entertainment and mildly sadistic fun, would cheer, jeer, and egg on the next victim. The puller would call for a volunteer, usually someone in real pain, and the performance began. The tooth was yanked out in front of everyone, held aloft like a trophy. Blood, that was part of the thrill. Screaming, even better. It proved the man was doing real work. After the extraction, the tooth puller might sell homemade remedies, bottles of herbal elixir, clove-soaked rags, or mysterious powders to keep the rot away. These were usually just mixtures of spices and wine, but they gave the illusion of aftercare. Whether they helped or not didn't matter. The crowd left entertained, the toothless man left dazed, and the puller left with a pocket full of coins. Some were surprisingly skilled. Others left a trail of broken teeth, split lips, and lawsuits, if such things had existed. Either way, they served a purpose. In places where no barber-surgeon operated and monasteries were miles away, these men were the last resort. They were medieval dentistry's answer to a drive-through. Quick, dirty, and unforgettable. So, next time you're sitting in a climate-controlled office staring at your dentist's polished tools, remember you could be in a muddy village square, surrounded by chickens, while a man in a feathered hat holds your molar up to a cheering crowd. If you thought having royal blood meant better dental care, think again. Medieval kings and queens might have owned gold, jewels, and castles, but their teeth were just as terrible as everyone else's, in some cases even worse. The upper classes had access to more food, but that didn't mean healthier options. Nobles gorged on sweet meats, dried fruits, white bread, and wine, all of which were devastating for teeth. Sugar, while rare, was a luxury imported from the East.
And when it did appear in the kitchens of the elite, it was used recklessly in pies, sauces, and preserved fruits. The result: rot, cavities, and breath that could slay dragons. Historical records suggest that many royal figures suffered from severe dental problems. King Henry V of England reportedly had loose and blackened teeth. Catherine de' Medici was known to have decayed teeth and chronic halitosis, likely from years of clove-stuffed chewing. And if you were a noblewoman, good luck. Beauty standards demanded a pale face, tiny waist, and a closed mouth, because a smile might reveal the truth: your mouth was a disaster. What did aristocrats do about it? They had access to the best barber surgeons, of course, which mostly meant getting their teeth yanked by someone in nicer clothing. Queen Elizabeth I famously suffered from terrible dental pain. She was so afraid of having a tooth pulled that one of her bishops had a rotten tooth extracted in front of her to prove it wasn't so bad. It didn't work. She refused treatment until the infection spread to her jaw. Nobles also tried to cover the problem with cosmetic tricks. Some painted their teeth white with lead-based powders, highly toxic of course. Others chewed perfumed pastilles to mask the stench of decay. Perfume for the mouth. Imagine that. No wonder courtships happened mostly through letters.
In portraits, you'll notice royal smiles are rare. That wasn't an artistic choice, it was practical. Smiling showed your teeth. And if your mouth looked like a battlefield of broken enamel, better to keep your lips firmly shut. So while peasants screamed in village squares and merchants stuffed honey into molars, the royals suffered behind velvet curtains, hiding their crumbling smiles with jewels, etiquette, and denial.
While extractions and tooth powders dominated the dramatic side of medieval dentistry, the daily reality was filled with strange habits, persistent myths, and a few surprisingly practical routines, if you knew where to look. Let's start with the basics. Most people didn't brush their teeth in the modern sense, but that doesn't mean they did nothing. Chewing sticks were common, especially among the poor. Twigs from aromatic trees like hazel, juniper, or mallow were frayed at one end and used to rub the teeth. Think of it as a primitive toothbrush with built-in flavor. Not effective against cavities, but better than letting roast goose sit on your molars for 3 days. Mouth rinses were another staple. People gargled with vinegar, wine, or even urine. Yes, urine. Based on the belief that its warmth and acidity could cleanse the mouth and kill invisible humors. Monks recorded recipes combining red wine, cloves, and sage, boiled and cooled to use as a rinse. Spicy and antiseptic, almost. Then there were the myths. Some believed that rubbing crushed emeralds or pearls on the teeth would keep them white. Others claimed that kissing a donkey, yes, a donkey, would cure toothache. The logic something to do with transferring pain. Still others thought a spider's web packed into a sore tooth would catch the pain and trap it. The spider was less thrilled. Breath was also a major concern, especially among the upper class. Bad breath wasn't just gross, it was considered a sign of spiritual decay. As a result, people chewed on fennel, cloves, and anise to keep their breath fresh during public events, court appearances, or confessions. The irony, of course, was that many of the things they chewed, like sugar-coated nuts, contributed to the very decay they were trying to hide. Children were taught early that tooth pain was a punishment for lying or gluttony. Some were made to pray every time they ate sweets. Others were given amulets to wear during teething.
Little bones, bits of coral, or charms etched with prayers. So while dental science was still centuries away, the medieval person did what they could. Armed with superstition, sticks, and stubbornness, they navigated oral hygiene as best they could, dodging decay with home remedies, prayers, and whatever wasn't nailed down in the herb garden. By the end of the medieval era, mouths across Europe were in shambles. But something was beginning to shift. Slowly, painfully, and with more trial than success, medieval dentistry began its long crawl toward becoming a real science. The seeds of change came from a few brave, or possibly deranged individuals who decided that maybe there was a better way than just yanking everything out. Late medieval and early Renaissance manuscripts began to include illustrations of teeth, jaws, and even primitive dental instruments. Arabic medical texts, particularly those of Avicenna and al-Zahrawi, were translated and circulated, offering more advanced ideas about oral hygiene and anatomy, ideas far beyond bone powder and barber pliers. Monasteries, too, began to keep better records. Monks documented successful treatments, refined herbal rinses, and even recorded which patients lived after tooth extractions and which, well, didn't. Trial and error may be grim, but it's still data. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the barber surgeons were beginning to separate. Some chose to specialize in surgery, and a few even focused on the mouth. The idea of a tooth specialist began to emerge. Not respected, not licensed, but at least recognized as something different from the guy who shaves your beard.
Cities began to regulate street pullers, forcing them to register or apply for permits. Some were banned from setting up in public squares altogether. The wild days of tooth extractions between sausage vendors were slowly fading. Emphasis shifted from spectacle to sanitation, though sanitation still mostly meant washing your hands in wine and hoping for the best. And perhaps most telling, people began to fear tooth pain less and fear bad teeth more. The aesthetics of the mouth were slowly gaining social currency. By the Renaissance, white teeth were seen as a mark of beauty, not just health. Perfumed pastes and enamel polishes made from crushed coral became fashionable among nobles. Smiling in portraits, even slightly, began to make a cautious return. Of course, real dentistry, complete with drills, fillings and anesthesia, was still centuries away, but the path had been cleared. The days of barber surgeons and travelling tooth pullers were numbered. So, next time you lean back in a padded chair, numbed and comforted, just remember, your dental experience today stands on a mountain of medieval molars, pulled by torchlight with pliers in a chicken-filled marketplace. And somehow humanity survived it, with most of its teeth intact. The Mongol Empire, a name that evokes images of vast steppes, galloping horses and unstoppable conquests, was built on an astonishingly simple yet remarkably effective diet. Life on the Mongolian steppe was unforgiving. Icy winters, blistering summers, endless winds, and no permanent kitchens. In that harsh environment, food had to be more than nourishing. It had to be portable, durable, and fast. Mongol warriors didn't sit down to long meals. They ate on the move, on horseback, sometimes in the saddle, and always with survival in mind. The backbone of this diet was meat, especially mutton, goat, and horse. But this wasn't the kind of meat you'd find sizzling over a fire every night. Most of it was air-dried, often in long, thin strips. Known as borts, this dried meat was a marvel of efficiency. It shriveled into leathery slivers that weighed almost nothing, could last for months, and could be rehydrated in boiling water for a hot meal anywhere, whether on campaign or in the middle of nowhere. Horses weren't just ridden, they were consumed. A wounded or old horse was never wasted. Horsemeat was considered warming and nourishing, ideal for the cold, dry climate. But more importantly, horses were mobile pantries. A Mongol could ride with a bag of borts tied to his saddle and a source of milk beneath him, his own mount. That milk, of course, became arag, the fermented mare's milk that was both a drink and a cultural icon. It was sour, fizzy, slightly alcoholic, and deeply tied to Mongol identity. A warrior could milk his horse, ferment the liquid in a leather bag hanging from the saddle, and drink it within a day or two. No bottles, no brewing vats, just steppe ingenuity. Brains and vegetables were rare in the open plains. The nomadic Mongols didn't farm, they herded. So bread, grains, and fruits weren't part of the daily routine. Instead, they relied on animal fat, meat, milk, cheese, and yogurt to survive. Even blood was consumed in emergencies, drawn from a horse's neck with a small cut, then sealed, keeping both horse and rider alive on the move. This wasn't a cuisine built for pleasure. It was built for conquest. Compact, rugged, high-calorie, and mobile, just like the warriors who ate it. And it fueled one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. If there was one drink that defined the Mongol spirit both literally and figuratively, it was arag. Also known in some regions as kumis, this fizzy fermented mare's milk wasn't just a beverage. It was a symbol of identity, strength, hospitality, and sometimes survival.
To make arag, Mongols milked their mares, yes, female horses, up to 6 times a day during the summer months. This milk was then poured into a leather sack, usually made from animal skin, and hung from the yurt's doorway or saddle.
It wasn't left alone. It was stirred constantly, sometimes by hand, sometimes by passing children, tasked with kicking or punching the bag as they ran past. Fermentation needed movement, and Mongols had no shortage of it. After a day or two, the milk would sour and fizz, transforming into a slightly alcoholic, tart, cloudy drink, with a kick strong enough to lift a weary rider's spirits. Arag wasn't distilled like vodka. It was natural, raw, and teeming with bacteria that made modern health inspectors sweat. But for Mongols, it was the nectar of life. Arag served many purposes. It quenched thirst, it provided vital calories, and it gave a buzz that Mongol warriors described as clarifying rather than dulling. In hot weather, it cooled. In cold weather, it warmed. During feasts, it was poured generously. During negotiations, it was offered with a bow. To refuse it was not only rude, it was deeply insulting. Guests arriving at a Mongol camp were traditionally greeted with a shallow silver bowl of arag. It was customary to take at least a sip, even if the taste shocked the tongue. Foreign visitors often described it as smoky vinegar churned with yogurt or milk that had gone too far. But for the Mongols, it was a sacred drink, and no feast, no matter how grand, was complete without it. There were also variations. Older arag could be distilled into a stronger liquor called archaic, clear, sharper, and not for the faint of heart. This became the Mongol version of spirits, used in toasts, rituals, and sometimes even in medicine. In short, arag was more than just fermented milk. It was fuel for the steppe, a tool of diplomacy, and a cultural cornerstone. To understand Mongol food is to taste arag, sour, wild, and unforgettable. The Mongol army didn't conquer half the known world on an empty stomach. Their battlefield rations were stripped down, brutal and effective, just like their campaigns. Forget army kitchens or supply caravans. Mongol warriors carried their food with them, sometimes tucked into their saddlebags, sometimes under the saddle itself, slowly warming as they rode. The most critical staple was borts, strips of dried meat, usually mutton or horse, sliced thin and left to dry in the open air until it became tough and leathery. It was as close to jerky as one could get without seasoning or sugar. Lightweight and nutrient-dense, borts could be eaten raw, like trail mix, or boiled into a simple soup. One handful could sustain a man for an entire day. But Mongols didn't stop at meat. They also relied heavily on fat, especially in the form of cakes or dumplings, made with rendered mutton fat, flour, and sometimes dried cheese. These high-calorie snacks were brutally efficient, dense, greasy, and packed with enough energy to power a horse raid at full gallop. They didn't melt, spoil, or crumble. You could ride for days with one stuffed in your sleeve. In colder regions, warriors also drank broth made from boiled animal bones, a rich, oily stock that helped maintain warmth and energy during long campaigns. Combined with dried meat and fat, it created a kind of proto-stew that could be heated quickly over a fire or even with hot stones dropped into a pot of water. For longer marches, warriors sometimes mixed borts with water in a flask, letting it steep throughout the day. By nightfall, they had a makeshift soup without needing to stop and cook. It wasn't delicious, but it worked. In emergency situations, Mongol soldiers had a gruesome fallback. They would cut a vein in their horse's neck, drink the blood, and seal the wound. The horse lived, the rider lived, and the campaign moved on. There were no fancy sauces, no spices, no courses. Mongol warrior food wasn't meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to keep you alive while galloping across thousands of miles of terrain. And it did that job with brutal, minimalist precision. When Mongols weren't raiding distant cities or galloping across the steppe, they actually did settle down, at least temporarily. And when they did, cooking shifted from saddle improvisation to a more stable, if still minimalist, domestic setup inside the gur, the traditional Mongol yurt. A gur wasn't just a home, it was a movable fortress of felt and wood designed to withstand the screaming winds of the steppe. Inside, space was sacredly organized. The door always faced south. The fire burned in the center, and the cooking happened right above it. The kitchen, such as it was, consisted of a metal tripod, a few cast-iron pots, and a supply of wood, dried dung, or animal fat for fuel. Mongol women typically handled food preparation. They didn't follow recipes, they followed survival. The most common method of cooking was boiling. Meat was chopped into chunks, fat was tossed in liberally, and everything was left to simmer in a rich broth. There were no spices, just the flavors of the meat, fat, and sometimes fermented milk products. Salt was a precious commodity and used sparingly, if at all. One beloved dish was korklog, a speciality made by stuffing a deboned marmot or goat with hot stones, sealing it tight and letting it cook from the inside out. The process was primitive, but the result was tender, juicy meat infused with smoky flavor. It was messy, theatrical, and undeniably Mongol. In colder months, milk was transformed into curds, yogurt, and cheese. These were either eaten fresh or dried into hard discs that could last for months. Dried curds, called arul, were so tough they could crack a tooth, but they were nutritious and kids gnawed on them like candy. Gur meals were communal, often eaten by hand with everyone seated on the floor. Meat was passed around, broth was slurped directly from bowls, and fingers were licked clean. Cleanliness was pragmatic. Knives were wiped on sleeves, and leftovers were tossed to the dogs or reused in the next meal. Despite its simplicity, the Jur kitchen was the heart of Mongol domestic life. It was where survival met routine, where the day's hunt became dinner, and where a nomadic family could for a moment feel rooted, even if the land beneath them was always shifting. For the average Mongol, food was fuel. But at the court of the Khans, food became politics, prestige, and power. The same warriors who lived off dried mutton and fermented milk on the steppe transformed into patrons of grand multicultural banquets when seated under the silk canopies of imperial courts. At the height of the Mongol Empire, especially during the reign of Kublai Khan, the kitchen went from campfire to culinary theatre. The empire had expanded from Hungary to Korea, and so had its pantry. Cooks were imported from Persia, China, India, and beyond, each bringing their regional flavors, methods, and ingredients to the imperial table. A Mongol court feast was a stunning contrast to the harshness of life on the steppe. There were roasted lambs, whole spit-roasted birds, and stuffed pastries filled with seasoned meats. Chinese cooks prepared delicate dumplings and rice dishes. Persian chefs offered rich stews, dates, nuts, and flatbreads perfumed with saffron. Indian spices occasionally made an appearance: fennel, cumin, and pepper brought by traders along the Silk Road. Drinks flowed freely, especially arag, of course, but also wine from the Caucasus, rice liquors from China, and stronger distilled spirits known as archaic. Gold and silver goblets passed from hand to hand while entertainers performed, singers, acrobats, even trained animals. The centerpiece of many banquets was a tower of cooked meat, sometimes sculpted into elaborate shapes: dragons, warriors, or horses. It was a display of both abundance and imperial power. To feed this well meant you could conquer anything. Yet even amid the extravagance, Mongol culinary values remained. Meat was king, dairy was sacred, and waste was frowned upon. Slabs of mutton still showed up beside delicacies. Bowls of broth were offered before and after the feast, symbolizing the humble origins of the nomads, now sitting on silk cushions. What made Mongol court feasts unique wasn't just the volume of food, it was the fusion. The empire's reach turned its kitchen into a diplomatic buffet, a showcase of diversity held together by the unshakable stomach of a people raised on boiled fat and fermented milk. To dine with a Khan wasn't just to eat, it was to taste the empire itself. In the Mongol Empire, food wasn't just nourishment or even celebration. It was a diplomatic weapon. A bowl of broth or a shared cup of fermented mare's milk could be more powerful than any treaty scroll. To sit and eat with a Mongol leader was not simply hospitality. It was recognition, a ritual of loyalty, and a test of mutual respect. Steppe diplomacy began with food. Foreign emissaries and merchants arriving at a Mongol camp or court were not immediately brought before the Khan. First they were fed. Airag was poured, mutton broth was served. The quality and order of dishes revealed everything: how honored the guest was, whether the Mongols considered them a friend or someone to watch. Declining food, especially airag, was a diplomatic disaster. Refusing to drink with the Mongols signaled distrust or superiority. Worse yet, it could imply disgust. To insult a nomad's food was to insult their identity. More than one negotiation ended prematurely because a delegate from some European court refused to sip the sour, bubbling drink of the steppe. And just like that, talks collapsed. But for those who embraced the ritual, the rewards were enormous. Merchants who shared their own dishes, dried fruits from Persia, dates from Baghdad, wine from Armenia, often found themselves welcomed, protected, and given special trading rights. The Mongols appreciated novelty, but only if it was offered with humility. Feasts were often used to cement alliances. Marriages, military agreements, and new vassals were celebrated over long tables strewn with lamb ribs and bowls of boiled dumplings. Guests were expected to eat heartily, not just as a courtesy, but as proof they could stomach the reality of being under Mongol rule. Food was also used as a subtle test. An ambassador might be offered a cut of meat from the shoulder, a position of honor. If the meat came from the rump, it was a polite way of saying, "You're not that important." A bowl of rich broth indicated respect. A bowl of thin milk, bare minimum. In the Mongol world, diplomacy began with the teeth. And to survive it, you had to know when to chew, when to toast, and when to nod politely with a mouthful of boiled fat. For a nomadic people constantly on the move, food preservation wasn't just smart, it was life-saving. Without pantries, cellars, or marketplaces, Mongols had to turn their diet into something mobile and shelf-stable. And they managed to do that using nothing more than wind, sun, salt, smoke, and sheer practicality. The most iconic preservation technique was air drying. Meat, especially mutton or horse, was sliced into narrow strips and hung from ropes strung between yurts or saddles. The cold, dry Mongolian air did the rest. Within days, the meat lost most of its moisture and became borts, the ultimate protein-packed travel ration. Properly dried, it could last for months, even years, without spoiling. This borts could be ground into powder and mixed with water to create quick soups, added to dough for dumplings, or simply chewed like jerky. It was light, compact, and virtually indestructible, perfect for warriors galloping across the Gobi or deep into enemy territory. Dairy, too, was preserved in ingenious ways. Milk was churned into butter, then clarified and stored as fat blocks. Yogurt was dried into arul, rock-hard cheese curds that could be eaten as is or softened in broth. These weren't snacks. They were edible insurance policies, capable of surviving a long winter or a failed hunt. Fermentation was another tool. As we've seen with airag, mare's milk was turned into a fizzy alcoholic drink. But cow, goat and sheep milk were also fermented into yogurt and sour creams, then stored in skin bags or pots. These products were acidic, resistant to spoilage, and added valuable probiotics. Though the Mongols didn't know that part, they just knew it worked. Salt curing and smoking were used when possible, especially in areas closer to rivers or forests. Fish could be smoked and tied to saddles. Organ meats were often boiled and stored in fat to prevent spoilage, a kind of rustic confit. Storage itself was creative. Mongols used leather bags, felt-wrapped bundles, and even the hollowed-out stomachs of animals to carry food. Saddlebags doubled as both transport and kitchen cabinet. There were no clay jars, no glass containers, just whatever you could strap to a horse and forget about until your next meal. In short, Mongols mastered the art of making food last without ever stopping. It wasn't fancy, but it kept them fed, fierce, and forever mobile. For the Mongols, food wasn't just fuel or pleasure, it was bound by ritual, superstition, and social code. What you ate, how you ate it, and who you shared it with said everything about your place in the world. And certain foods, they were not to be taken lightly. Mongol spiritual beliefs, rooted in Tengrism, the ancient steppe religion, shaped their relationship with food. Animals weren't just meat on legs, they were sacred life-givers. Every part of the animal had a purpose, and wasting food was not only wasteful, it was spiritually dangerous. Blood, for instance, was both life-giving and taboo. Though horse blood might be drunk in emergencies, the spilling of blood in a domestic setting, especially indoors, was considered deeply impure. Meat was ideally butchered outside with great care and shared among the group to ensure balance and respect. The fire in the yurt used for cooking was sacred. You didn't throw bones into it. You didn't shout or curse near it. And under no circumstance did you ever step over it. Doing so was believed to insult the spirits and bring misfortune, not just to the person who committed the act, but to the entire camp. Certain foods were avoided altogether. Dog meat was generally taboo among Mongols in contrast to some neighboring cultures. Fish was rarely eaten, despite Mongolia's rivers and lakes. The reason, water spirits. Fishing was seen as disruptive, and water was considered a pathway for spirits, both good and bad. To eat what lived in it could draw unwanted attention from the other world. Leftovers, too, were treated carefully. Uneaten food wasn't thrown out casually. Bones were buried or fed to animals. Liquids were never poured into the fire or onto the ground near the yurt. Everything had its place because everything could offend something unseen. And then there was hospitality, practically a religion itself. Offering food to a guest, even a stranger, was mandatory. Denying someone meat or milk, even if you had little yourself, was not just rude, it was shameful. Hospitality ensured survival. And in the vast empty steppe, it might be the only thing that kept you from starving during a snowstorm. In Mongol culture, every bite carried meaning. Food was survival, yes, but also spirit, order, and honor. The Mongol Empire may have crumbled, but its foodways galloped far beyond the steppes, leaving traces in cuisines from Eastern Europe to China, from the Middle East to Siberia. As the empire expanded, so did the reach of its recipes, ingredients, and attitudes toward food. Simple, practical, mobile, and meat-centered. Take dumplings, for example. Variants of stuffed dough can be found across the former Mongol territories. Booz in Mongolia, manti in Central Asia, pelmeni in Russia, and baozi in China. They differ in size and spice, but all share the same concept: ground meat wrapped in dough, easy to cook in batches and simple to transport. It's not a stretch to say Mongol influence helped these recipes spread and evolve across borders. Fermented dairy, too, left a mark. The tradition of sour milk drinks like kefir in the Caucasus or ayran in Turkey reflects a legacy of nomadic milk preservation pioneered on the steppes. The belief in the strength-giving power of sour milk didn't fade, it adapted. Even today, travelers across Central Asia still encounter ayrag's modern cousins, some just as fizzy, just as pungent. Meat-centric stews and skewers, from Uyghur lamb kebabs to Siberian game soups, carry echoes of Mongol hearth meals. The lack of spices, the focus on meat and fat, the minimal use of grains, these are culinary footprints of steppe life. Even the Persian dish, cello kebab, though now richly spiced, evolved during Mongol rule when meat on a stick became imperial fare. In China, the Yuan dynasty under Kublai Khan opened court kitchens to multicultural experimentation. Recipes from Persia, India, and the steppes were recorded in imperial cookbooks. Mongol court banquets influenced Ming-era cuisine, layering Central Asian stews into the foundations of Chinese hotpot culture. But perhaps the strongest legacy is the attitude that food is power. The Mongols taught the world that what you feed your warriors, your guests, and even your enemies can shape politics and empires. They proved that a man could live off borts and fermented milk and still conquer kingdoms. Today, the food of the Mongol Empire survives in echoes. In the tang of yogurt, the stretch of dumpling dough, the sizzle of lamb over coals. You just have to know where to look and be brave enough to take a bite. From the silent, perfumed struggles of an Egyptian concubine to the boisterous, often terrifying public spectacle of a medieval bedding ceremony, and then to the stark, practical survival and surprising diplomacy of the Mongol diet, we've journeyed through moments of history that challenge our modern perceptions. It's a reminder that beauty, intimacy, and sustenance have always been intertwined with power, expectation, and the raw, unvarnished realities of existence. As you drift off, consider how much has changed, and yet how some fundamental human experiences echo across the centuries. The need for connection, the desire for status, the basic instinct to survive. These are threads that weave through every era. May your own sleep be peaceful, free from the pressures of ancient harems, medieval public scrutiny, or the need to drink mare's milk. Rest well and dream of gentler times, or simply of a quiet, uninterrupted night. Sweet dreams.